So good morning to everybody. This is the second part of looking at Yorkshire people and really between 1860 and 1905. So we're moving towards the end of a century now, and here we have a literary giant, another chap from Bradford as well, J.B. Priestley. But the B stands for Boynton, but it actually wasn't on his birth certificate. It was just christened or named John Priestley, and I couldn't find out when the Boynton was added, and it wasn't his mother's maiden name either. Her mother's maiden name was Holt, so I'm not quite sure where that came from. He was born on the 13th of September 1894 at 34 Mannheim Road, again in Manningham. Mannheim Road still exists, and this house there has got a plaque on it. It's a fairly typical one of when I've shown where other people have been born, a red brick terrace house on quite a long street. So it lies really, if you know Bradford at all, between Lister Park and Manningham Mills. So they're not far apart from one another, I'd say less than half a mile. And the road is in between there. And he went to well, his father was a headmaster, so that probably had something to do with his literary upbringing there as well. His mother, you could say Emma, she died when he was just 2 years old. His father remarried 4 years later, and it seemed one of these things, because there always seemed to be sort of tension between stepmothers and previous children, but it doesn't seem to be the case here. He went to Bellevue Grammar School, and again, if you sort of know this area of Bradford, it's not an area I'm known, but it does say on my birth certificate, but I was born in Bradford. I asked my mother why, and she said Bradford had a reputation than Leeds. So there you go, make what you think of that. And that's near the Royal Infirmary. It's on the road that goes out to Cottingley. And if you know that sort of area, it's towards just beyond where Hallmark cards were before it drops down to Cottingley and to Bingley. It would have been about a 10-15 minute walk from his house to get there. It was opened, just to sort of make some other types of links there, in 1879 by MP and owner of Greenhome Mills down in Burley and Wharfdale, W.E. Forster. And say he was one of those chaps who believed in education. And I think when I've done his story is that when he bought Greenhome Mills, he actually inherited a lot of pauper children in there as well as part of his workforce. He then built a school next to the mill, and I can say that mill still exists down there. I think it might be being converted into flats since I've last been into the mill complex, because that's off the dual carriageway in between the village of Burley and Wharfdale and the other side where the River Wharf is. Anyway, let me not digress any more of that. At 16, he went to become a junior clerk at Helm & Co. And that was a wool company, and they were based in the Swan Arcade, right in the centre of Bradford. It was another one of those unfortunate buildings that were lost to demolition in the 1960s, along with the market hall, which I mentioned the other day. And so it could say it was like it had like spokes that went into the middle, and it could say it was a great loss for that. And even JB himself lamented its destruction. He was there from 1910 to 1914. And that was really some of his literary career to the start of his literary career, because he wrote short stories in the evening and then sent them off to papers. He didn't get paid for them, but the fact is that they were published. In 1914, World War I broke out, and he joined the Duke of Wellington's regiment. He could have joined the Bradford Pals, because they recruited right down into the city centre as well. But it was a bit of luck on his side, because I think really the Bradford Pals were decimated on the first day of the Somme. But he was hit in a trench mortar and in 1916, in June of that year, and then he was sent back to Britain to recover. And like a lot of men, when they did recover, they found themselves back on the front line again. But it seems that he'd been a commissioned officer I could say probably during his recoupment, and then was sent back over to France, joining the Devonshire Regiment. he probably didn't have any choice in that, because so many regiments were devastated during World War One, is that men were just sent to form up with other regiments to make up numbers. So it wouldn't have been his choice. He'd been sent back to France, and that's where he was posted to. But like I say, he arrived there in late summer 1918, and really the war was almost over by then. He described his war experiences in a book called Margin Release, and because obviously in the first part of the war he'd suffered from poison gas as well. Demobilized in early 1919, and he was quite lucky, because a lot of these soldiers, when they were demobilized, if they were clever and quick enough, they could actually apply for grants or educational grants, and he did this as well. And because he was accepted at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and completed his degree in 2 years, although he stayed on for a third. Largely because it's one of those quirky type things, is that you can only get a degree if you've actually studied for 3 years. So even though if you're super bright or clever or whatever, you can complete them earlier than that, it normally you'd have to stay on for your third year. And I think I mentioned that with another chap earlier on as well. He returned to Bradford in 1921 and married Emily Tempest, generally known as Pat, and she was a librarian in Bradford, and they had 2 daughters born, but unfortunately she died in 1925. In September 1926, I've always talked about these quirky sort of private lives that these people, most of these people have covered, have. He married Jane Wyndham Lewis, so the ex-wife of that novelist, and had a further 2 daughters and a son with him, of course. And because he did marry a third time, because we'll mention her a bit later on. But he could say he wasn't particularly successful in his writing until the novel The Good Companions was published in 1929. And then he published his first theatre play, Dangerous Corner, in 1913. Taken up very quickly and went on to the West End the following year, although his best known play is An Inspector Calls, that he published in 1945. Oddly, it wasn't acted in Britain to begin with. Its first public performance was in Russia, in Moscow, before it opened in London the following year, 1946. And it might be because it might have been approved because of his socialist leanings that it was taken on there, because obviously the Russians were very sort of censorious of actually what people could see, watch and read as well. So it's quite an unusual one, that is as well. And they can say that play, Inspector Calls, has been made into several television films and into radio productions as well. And so most of his settings that we find in his novels and plays are always in northern industrial cities. In the Second World War, he became a very popular radio broadcaster. He was second to Churchill for people to tune into. Churchill didn't particularly like this, largely because of his left-wing leanings, and actually it was successful in banishing him from the airways for a while. But like I say, his popularity on there made him being reinstated. And like I say, probably his views in broadcasting to the nation was probably part of just one small part of the reason, perhaps, why there's a landslide election in 1945 and Labour came into power. In 1953, he divorced his second wife and married the archaeologist, this lady that we see pictured here, Jaquetta Hawkes. There was quite a bit of an age difference between them. She was 18 years younger than him. Because he also had a number of affairs, including a serious relationship with actress Peggy Ashcroft. She's a lady that starred in A Jewel in the Crown, A Passage to India, the filmmaker about David Lean. And in writing in 1972, he described himself as lusty and as one who had enjoyed the physical relations with the sexes without the feelings of guilt, which seems to disturb some of my most distinguished colleagues. So he seemed to do what he wanted to do, because unfortunately for those women involved in his life. So the University of Bradford awarded him the title of Doctor of Letters in 1970, and he was awarded the Freedom of the City of Bradford in 1973. There's also a J.B. Priestley Library at Bradford University, which he officially opened in 1975. The Bradford Playhouse on the Leeds Road, because they had J.B. Priestley as its president for 25 years. And his mother and sister, his second mother, helped started the theatre in 1929. In his lifetime, he published over 150 works, including many newspaper articles as well. Died of pneumonia on the 14th of August, 1984, aged 89. He'd never sort of lived back in Bradford after his childhood, but seemed to have an affinity with it the whole of his life. He died at Stratford-upon-Avon, where he lived, and his ashes are buried in Hubberholme churchyard at the top of Wharfdale. And here we see also in Bradford his statue standing in front of the library and the Media Museum as well. It was unveiled by Giacchetta on the 31st of October 1986. And so that, I think he probably has got his pipe in this hand here. It's a bit larger than life, probably like him himself, because I think this statue stands 7.5 feet tall. But like I say, it's done by a chap called, I'm just looking for it, Ian Judd. He produced this out at Halifax in Dean Clough, where there's an artist in residence around there. When I did Halifax, I'd actually been into his studio and he spoke a bit about his work, because he also did the memorial on top of the Leeds War Memorial in front of the Henry Moore Gallery as well. The previous one rusted and was due to fall down. So that's one part of his work as well. I think he'd done the Madonna and Child, which is in Wakefield Cathedral. Anyway, that's another story. Let's move on to the next, I can't say chap because it's a lady, moving on to Phyllis Bentley. And look at that industrial backdrop there of Halifax, because that's the parish church, or Halifax Minster as it's known today, and so you can see where the power stations are that lined up the valley. That spire up there, that's Edward Ackroyd's church next to his mills, and all this down here, that's Crossley's carpet mill, now Dean Clough. So actually a link there between J.B. Priestley and Phyllis Bentley. I don't know if they knew one another, but she was one of the great writers of the 1930s. She seems to be out of flavour at the moment. And I think a lot of these writers from the 30s are, they sold millions of books in their lifetimes, but are largely unknown today. She was born Phyllis Eleanor Bentley on the 19th of November, 1894. In Halifax. We'll see that she didn't move far either, just rather like Percy Shaw, who moved half a mile down the road at Boovetown. That's why I'm pointing out that the spire of the church there, because that is the Boovetown area of Halifax. That's where Percy Shaw, the man who did the Cat's Eyes, lived up there. And she was the fourth and last daughter of a mill owner, Joseph Bentley, who had his own woolen textile finishing company at Dunkirk Mills in the centre of the town. But she said she lived in a very Victorian household, where obviously her father ruled in there, and everybody, because he would have been well, she was born in Victorian times anyway, but she always complained about that, is that sort of liberation held her back in her writings. She had a good education. She went to the Princess Mary High School for Girls, that still exists under the name of Halifax High School for Girls today, and then went further south, a long way further south, to Cheltenham Ladies College in 1910. She studied down there and also did a correspondence degree in English and Maths from London University, which she finished in 1914. So that was quite common in those days as well, to take these sort of correspondence degrees. I know quite a lot of other ladies did that in order to gain qualifications to become teachers and other things as well, or were actually welcome to go into the Mechanics Institutes as well to take some of these scientific qualifications that you could get through them. That's really the only way that they could do it, maybe because the parents would accept them doing it through the post, or they'll be just going for one evening for a few hours and then coming back again. But she went to a boys' grammar school in London. But I think, like a lot of teachers, that they try and think they could maintain control of that, and it didn't really work out for her at all. 1915, she remained down in London and then worked in a munitions factory, and only came back up to Halifax after the war. And she sort of taught English and maths then at Heath Grammar School. It's now called the Crossley Heath Grammar School, again in Halifax, and that was got its charter in 1585. In 1918, she published her first work, a collection of short stories called The World's Bane. And because she wasn't particularly successful after that until March 1913. And when she published her best known work called Inheritance in that year. And again, rather like J.B. Priestley, living up here and being around these mill towns, that novel looks really about the textile industry. She calls it the West Riding, but I guess it's from personal experience in Halifax. And a very popular novel, published 23 times before 1946. And that made her a household name. Her fame even went across the Atlantic. And in 1934, she embarked on her first of several lecture tours of America. I always imagined her as being sort of having a broad accent, but I guess she probably didn't, going to Cheltenham Girls' School and things like that. So she's probably maybe quite a refined lady. She looks sort of a bit manly in that photograph there. But she said, "I was a Yorkshire girl and proud of it. I love the hills rolling away into the distance, springing out of each other in complex folds, which are, as it were, smiled sardonically at my efforts to find a word to describe them. I love the purple heather and the dark rock, the russet bracken, the tumbling streams, the tough pale grass, the rough mortarless walls. Above all, I love the strong west winds, driving the great grey clouds relentlessly across the sky." So, lovely description of Yorkshire, but she continues, "But I did not love the West Riding people. I was at great Uncle Jack's side. I was an intellectual. Yorkshire people were strong, stubborn, independent folk. Yes, I granted them that, but they were often coarse, as in rough. They said to me cheerfully, 'I haven't read any of your books,' as if it were a virtue on their part. They said, 'Do you make anything by it then? Not much, eh? Is it worth it then?' For they loved brass." And I've mentioned that before on all these people proceeding, that their fathers always more interested in the brass, the money to be made, rather than any other pursuit beyond that. We saw that with Frederick Delis as well, his father trying to get him into his woolen business as well, and rebelling against it, and his father eventually giving in to him. But I guess that Phyllis might not have had that. She might have been educated to make a marriage of convenience with some other mill owner, but she never did marry. And because really after the war, her main problem was with a lot of the 1930s authors is that they were sort of discarded straight away. And we had the sort of the angry young men come in, John Osborne and the like of that, in not only in sort of literature, but in the theatre as well. And so her time was probably seen as passé, even though it was only been 10, 15 years earlier than that when she was very popular. Because she was also interested in the local area as well. So they weren't all sort of fiction that she wrote. There's a couple of sort of ones which are, I guess they might be popular today, sort of based on sort of historical sort of romance type of thing. One of the things she looked at was a children's novel called Gold Pieces, which is really an account through the eyes of a 12-year-old boy of being and sort of at the side of watching the crag coiners. These are the men that lived in the Short Valley, a bit higher up Calderdale. It runs off Myvam from Myvam Road, and that's where these men up in the hills there clipped coins to make them and then hammered them out to make them the same size, but with the gold clippings, then remelted those and created them into more coins around there. Because the most popular character there was a king called David Hartley, and he was caught and hung on the Knavesmire in York for that on the 28th of April 1770. So it's sort of, she wrote about the local area as well. Perhaps a bit later on in the 50s and 60s, she wrote 24 detective novels starring Miss Marion Phipps, and that was first serialized in 1937 and then came into full-blown novels after that. Again, being published right up into the 1970s, a year, but she was awarded an OBE. But apart from that short period of living down in London, she only ever lived in Halifax. She moved out of the family home in 1963, and which was at Heath Villas on Free School Lane, and she moved 3.5 miles to the village of Worley, and spent the rest of her life there. It's like a 17th century yeoman clothier's house around there. She died aged 82 on the 27th of June 1977. So we've had sort of two authors in a row there. So it looks like we're due a scientist now, John Cockcroft. And he was born up in Todmorden and got the Nobel Peace Prize. He's not the only man from Todmorden who got a Nobel Peace Prize as well. So it's unusual for one town to have these two notable men in science get that prize. He was born on the 27th of May 1897, and another man who associated with the mills. His father was also a mill owner, and his mother, called Annie, her maiden name was Fielden, and it was really the Fieldens that were the cotton kings of Todmorden, and we see that they were a family dynasty with the father there establishing the cotton mills and becoming MP for the area as well. He opposed the sort of Poor Law Acts of 1834, refused to have a workhouse built in the Todmorden area. They say it was 50 years after his death before it was built. I've mentioned them, I think, a few weeks ago. They built some of the churches in Todmorden as well. So that's, like I say, she came from a very wealthy family as well, all involved in probably the cotton trade up there. And I say he was taught at Walsden. This is only Todmorden is at the sort of the head of the Calder Valley. We've got one valley that goes up to Burnley. The other valley goes through Walsden and then goes down to Rochdale. Walsden from the centre of Todmorden is only a couple of miles. Went to the local Church of England school there from 1901 to 1908. And I say it's quite important, these educational type things, because they're all sort of local people that sort of broke out from here. He was at the Todmorden Elementary School and then the Todmorden Secondary School from 1909 to 1914. And it was at school that he met his future wife, Eunice Crabtree. In 1914, he won a county major scholarship to Victoria University at Manchester, and I guess that's Manchester University today, and he studied mathematics there. And again, he was caught up in World War I due to his age and was joined in 1916, become a signaller, and he was on the part of that push late on or early on in 1918, when the army were pushing through the Hindenburg line and went through to a further battle at Ypres before the sort of war came to an end. He came back during there in January 1919, but didn't return to finish his degree at the university, but instead enrolled at Manchester Municipal College of Technology. Whether that came Manchester Polytechnic or not, I've no idea. And he studied electrical engineering there and gained a BSc in June 1920. He then joined a large company, which still sort of is around today, called Metropolitan Vickers. It's an electrical engineering company, putting wiring into major industrial complexes. And it was there under a chap he was working with who probably saw that he was bright and had a future in this, and suggested he sat for a scholarship at St John's College at Cambridge. I think that's the third time in this talk, including Monday, is that somebody went to St John's College at Cambridge and they won a £30 scholarship and a £20 bursary for people from poor backgrounds as well. Metropolitan Vicars gave him £50 as well, subject him to returning to the business after completing his degree there. And his aunt made up the balance of the costs for a year of £316. And because he'd already got his earlier degree, is that he only had to do this in 2 years as well. Because he married that girl he met at school, Elizabeth Crabtree, in 1925 at the Bridge Street United Methodist Church in Todmorden, and they had 6 children together. In 1933, he, along with a chap called Ernest Walton, managed to produce radioactivity. And really, it was toying with this that he sort of came across nuclear fusion. And it was this work which in 1951 led him to getting the Nobel Peace Prize for Physics. But it was really, he developed more of this during the Second World War. In 1938, a chap called Sir Henry Tizard, he was developing, and I have to put this in words I've taken elsewhere, airborne interceptors using radar technology. So I guess it went up with Edward Appleyard that we've met earlier as well, working in this sphere as well. And these were sort of being developed along with sort of these coastal early warning radar stations as well, built by the RAF to detect and track aircraft movement across there. And he was one of these men who helped get that system operational. And the idea was that if a shell could explode when it was near an enemy aircraft, a near miss would be as effective as a direct hit. So those were the sort of exploding bombs that could bring an aircraft down. And because the technical problem there was to get a radar set, which obviously a part of the bomb that went up, that it would detect where that plane was, and then because it would bring that plane down. So that's what he was doing, and because a lot of problem solving in that. In fact, one of the things that did help him was a dud German bomb that was salvaged that had valves inside of it, and it was the valves that sort of overcame the technical problems, and therefore it would work. In 1946, at the end of the war, he was director of the Atomic Energy Research Establishment, or Harwell, that was based at RAF Harwell, south of Oxford. And his plan there was to look after the whole development of Britain's atomic power programme. He created the world's biggest reactor in 1947, capable of generating 10 megawatts of power. Because he did this by replacing uranium rods clad in stainless steel and cooled by heavy water. And he was knighted for this as well in 1948. In 1951, like I say, he got the Nobel Peace Prize for, alongside Ernest Walton, who was developing that in the war years, for their pioneer work on the transmutation of atomic nuclei by artificially accelerated atomic particles. Somebody out there will probably understand what I've said, but it's really popularly referred to as splitting the atom. But he was also responsible for building the first nuclear power station in Britain. And this was at Windscale, it's now called Sellafield, but it's actually at sea scale on the Cumbrian coast, just outside the Lake District National Park. That opened in 1950 and was given an operational lifespan of 5 years. But it was still producing atomic energy in October 1957. And on that 10th of October, fire broke out in one of the reactors. And that led to a blaze inside the reactor. And because of that, fire burnt for 3 days and escaped radioactive material spread both across Britain and across Europe. It still remains Britain's worst nuclear disaster. But it could have been far worse, because filters were added to the chimneys at actually great cost. and actually created a bit of a bulge in the chimneys as well. And they were thought to be unnecessary, and amusing were dubbed Cockcroft's folly, largely because the people didn't the cost and they never needed it. But it's thought that those filters caught 95% of the radioactive dust that was being emitted during that fire. He died in 18th of September 1967 in age 69 at Churchill College at Cambridge. The other chap I mentioned who got a Nobel Peace Prize from Toppenden was Geoffrey Wilkinson, but because he wasn't born until 1921. He discovered many substances with molecules have a type of sandwich structure, according to a Wikipedia entry. I've no more than that. So let's return to something a bit more lightweight and returning to a Yorkshire author, but you would never ever consider to have been born in Yorkshire. And it's this chap, Eric Knight. He was born at Menston and in 10th of April 1897. I don't think there's many famous people from Menston, and people, I guess, if you stopped in Menston today and asked if they heard of Eric Knight, they'd probably say no. It's always been rather a dormitory town in between Guiseley and Burley and Wharfdale, and probably better known for its the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum that has now been converted into apartments, flats and houses around there, nearly opposite where Harry Ramsden's fish and chip shop is, or was, now called the Wetherby Whaler. And he was the youngest of 3 sons born to Frederick Harrison Knight and his wife Marion Hilda, and they were born into a Quaker family around there as well. Rather, a colourful sort of life that his family led as well. His father was a rich diamond merchant, and he got caught up in the Boer War being down in South Africa and actually got killed as part of that. I couldn't find out. I don't think he was a serving soldier, but I just think he happened to be there and got killed down there. And Eric was just 2 years old at the time. Then his mother, unusually, I had no idea how this happened, she moved to St. Petersburg, where she was a governess to the royal family out there. And he remained in Menston, being raised by an aunt and an uncle, and went to school down there, left at age 13, and went to work in a local mill. So I guess it might have been one of the Guiseley mills down there, one which still operates today down there by the railway station, and the one next door to it makes Wendy wools, the sort of the knitting wool down there. So it could have been possibly one of those two, but there are a myriad number of other mills in Guiseley down there at the time. His mother returned in 1912, and probably should be couldn't stay in one place for long. So returning from Russia to Menston, she then took Eric off in 1912 to go and live in Philadelphia in America. And it might have been a fairly logical thing, but I've mentioned before, there's a huge trade depression that lasted from about late 1910 right through to the start of World War I. And there were lots of adverts for emigrating to Canada, emigrating to Australia as well in the paper. So maybe she thought she had a better chance out there. I've no idea. There's more opportunity out there. But he never returned to Britain after that, but he never forgot his English roots. In 1917, he was very much a patriot, as we see. He crossed from Philadelphia into go to Toronto in Canada, that enabled him to sign up with the British Army, or the Canadian version of it. He joined the Princess Pat Regiment. Just before leaving in 1917, he married Dorothy Hall on the 28th of July 1917. He did return from the war and had 3 daughters with her. And because he was fairly lucky, his mother gave birth to 2 other sons. So there's 3 sons in the family. And both of his other brothers were killed in World War I. And most unusually on the same day, but in different locations. His marriage didn't survive, and he remarried on the 2nd December 1932 to a woman called Bulansky. I'm not pronouncing that again because it's probably wrong to begin anyway. But no one really knows much about his life. No one's sort of ever written about him, but it's assumed that he went back to the army because, as you see here, he's got his army uniform in here because he was still serving as a major in the army in the Second World War as well. So I guess he wouldn't progress to become a major unless he remained in the army. But his first novel was published in 1934, Invitation to Life. And it really is his childhood, and I guess the same with J.B. Priestley and Phyllis Bentley, is that it's sort of probably awareness when you're teenage years of roaming around and seeing these things, because most of his books were set in northern cities as well. And I say this book was published in America, where you thought there might have been quite a small audience for this type of book. After this, he went to, because they're still remaining in Pennsylvania, he bought a farm, and it was there that him and his wife, they raised collies, and that led to him writing his most famous novel, Lassie Come Home, published in 1940. Again, the novel is set with a Yorkshire backdrop to that, although when it was made into a film by MGM in 1943, starring Roddy McDowall, the scenery had changed back to America. And really, that was that one novel that made his name. And like I say, it was made into numerous films, into television series in the 1960s, and really Lassie became, as we see here with his collie, a sort of an iconic thing of sort of returning home after being lost. He became an American citizen in 1942, maybe because he wanted then again to be part of the war and join the US Army as a major there. And so he had a very high standing there, but that really led to his, I can say, his downfall, really, because he was on a plane going from America to West Africa on January 15th, 1943, and it crashed over in the ocean over Suriname. It's believed to have been shot down by a German news boat because they believed, quite rightly as well, the intelligence that Roosevelt was on that plane, but he wasn't. 30 minutes before takeoff, he switched to another plane and obviously successfully got there. Eric Knight was aged 42. His posthumous novel published in 1948 is called The Flying Yorkshireman. And they say there's not much about him, but unveiled on Menston Library is a plaque to his memory, and that was unveiled in 2011. So I guess that that's the only sort of thing he has in Yorkshire, because all his books have got sort of Yorkshire backgrounds to them. This man certainly has, coming from the one that's an urbane area of Yorkshire to, quite a coal mining town of Castleford, completely different. So here we see Henry Spencer Moore, born on the 30th of July, 1898 at 30 Roundhill Road. I've taken this off Google Street View, and it's quite unusual because of all the properties on this street, only this, I guess, probably 2 or 3 houses that stood here have been demolished. All the rest remain like this. So that's what the house would have looked like. I say there's the blue plaque on there. Whether some town planner was trying to emulate some of Henry Moore's work, I don't know, but it seems these concrete posts and concrete playground without any swings and slides or anything, because it's probably a bit lost on him. But he is commemorated in Castleford. He donated a piece here, which is called Reclining Figure, imaginatively, because he did rather a lot of reclining figures. And this stands on the road, on the Pontefract Road, as you are going into Castleford itself. It stands outside some municipal offices. I don't know what he'd made of that, but he probably thought it was quite good fun, and probably quite amused at its location where it was built. And because he was the 7th of 8 sons as well. His father Raymond, he was a miner, but he sort of had I guess he read and studied widely and instilled that upon his sons. He didn't want any of them to go down the mine, and probably that's why he probably forced them into education, the importance of that. Like I say, he went to infant and elementary schools up until 1910, and then won a scholarship to Castleford Secondary School, later becoming Castleford Grammar School. I don't think it's probably there anymore. But aged 18, for reasons unclear, but maybe he wanted to spread his wings. Perhaps he maybe thought he was stifled in Castleford and be no really opportunity to get on there. He travelled to London to enlist in the army. Say he was injured in 1917 during a gas attack on the Battle of Cambrai. And during recovery back in Britain, he trained as a PT instructor and landed back in France just as the armistice was being signed. And again, in 1919, when he returned, he got hold of an ex-serviceman's grant that enabled him to enroll at the Leeds School of Art, where he was a contemporary of Barbara Hepworth, even though she was 5 years younger. But there was that sort of that war years that quite often with a lot of men, marriage and families and things like that, there was a sort of a discontinuity really. And therefore he lost effectively, I guess, 5 years of his life. So he was at Leeds art school for 2 years, and then won a scholarship for the Royal College of Art in London and moved down there in 1921. So down there again for 3 years. At the end of that, he got a travel grant to go to Italy, and more later returned to the college part-time until 1931. And it was there that he met Irina Radetzky. I think all these people do this for me, to have sort of relations with Russian people or people from the from Eastern Europe. She was a painting student down there, and they got married a year later in 1922. So at that time, he was exhibiting his works and attracting some attention as well. And in 1928, gained a commission to design the facade of St James's Station on the Underground that remains there to this day. He then went to teach at the Chelsea School of Art because an article appeared whilst he was at the Royal College of Art that declared, "Frankly, we think that Mr. Moore's work is a menace from which students at the Royal College should be protected." So maybe he felt that he wasn't valued there, and the Chelsea would value him more. When war broke out again, he was recruited as an official war artist, and because they produced his sort of drawings of people in the London Underground during the Blitz. In September 1940, the flat that he was living in was damaged by a bomb, and the couple moved out to Perry Green in Hertfordshire, a farmhouse called Hoglands, and that's where he was to remain for the rest of his life. Surprisingly, his first sort of retrospective exhibition was alongside, not that it's unusual, but being alongside Graham Sutherland and John Piper, but it's unusual that his first retrospective was at Temple Newsam in Leeds in 1941. In he'd had a daughter, Mary, born in 1946, and which he said, "It re-invoked in my sculpture my mother and child theme." And because this led in the 1950s, as we've seen previously, to his famous reclining sculptures. This one is in front of the of Leeds Art Gallery, where the Henry Moore Gallery is next door to it. And they're probably his most famous sculptures, these. In 1977, he established the Henry Moore Foundation to encourage wider enjoyment and opportunities in the arts, and also to promote his work, of course. Some of these he gave to the Tate, 6 sculptures and a complete set of his graphics. In 1982, the Henry Moore Sculpture Gallery opened in Leeds, and also the Centre for Study of Sculpture. And although it opened in 22nd of April 1982 by Lord Goodman, he was chair of the Henry Moore Foundation, is that Henry Moore actually himself laid the foundation stone in 1980, and that's probably the last time he came up to Leeds. He died in 1986 in Hertfordshire, aged 88, on the 31st of August 1986. His wife Irina died the following year. So that's Henry Moore, because they leaving his mark in Leeds with the Henry Moore Gallery. As we'll see, the relationship he had with Barbara Hepworth, it will come into the next one after that, because that's really the celebrated sort of Yorkshire sculpture triangle that we have with the Hepworth Gallery in Wakefield, the Yorkshire Sculpture Park just the other side of Wakefield, and obviously the Henry Moore Gallery right there in the centre of Leeds. Talk about Ian Judd and his sculptures. There's the war memorial that the sculptor Ian Judd did for the that he did of J.B. Priestley, and now above the war memorial here. It's quite odd, these coincidences. I hadn't noticed that before when I put the photograph in. So let's come on to a very famous person here, Amy Johnson. I said to my children the other day, they're sort of, she's a teacher, aged 25, and my son who's 21, is it? Yes. You know, I mentioned some of these people. Yes, I'd heard of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth and things like that. And I said Amy Johnson, but they'd never heard of her, which is a shame, really, because she lived at a time, like I said, at the time of Phyllis, Bentley and things like that, where there were few opportunities for women to get on in life. But some of these people were able to break that mould in the time of when there were suffragettes agitation around as well, during these sort of 1900 to 1920. Until the women get the vote in 1928. And some of these were people that broke the mould, because Hull's normally well known for its shipping, but because Amy Johnson put Hull on the map for aviation, completely different types of things. Born in Hull on the 1st of July 1903 on St George's Road. It's a red brick terrace house, rather like that one that Henry Moore was born in. It's got a bay window and it still stands down there. It's just off the A63. That's the main dual carriageway that goes into Hull, called the Clive Sullivan Way. And because if you take the exit off by St Andrew's Quay Junction, that takes you into it. I can't explain any better than that, but you'll need to look at a Google map. But there's a plaque on the house down there where she lived. And because she was, her mother, her father was involved in the fish trade as well, and that's it. Her maternal grandfather, William Hodge, was the mayor of Hull as well. And but her father, John, he was involved in the fish trade as a merchant, and of the company Andrew Johnson, Nuston and Company. So because that was a background, so we sort of weren't poor or anything like that. So we're quite a well-known, wealthy family as well. She was the eldest of three sisters and went to Boulevard Municipal Secondary School, now called Kingston High School. In 1918, they moved to 85 Park Avenue in Hull until 1927. That's a much grander house. It's sort of semi-detached and more of a leafy suburb. And that also has a blue plaque to say that Amy lived here. She then did a BA in economics at Sheffield University, and afterwards worked in London as a secretary to a solicitor, William James Croker. But she found it incredibly dull. I think she probably had this joie de vivre, and because it was introduced by somebody, it's not been mentioned who this somebody was, to flying as a hobby, and gain an aviator's certificate 28th of January 1929, and then a pilot's license a bit later on that year on the 6th of July. Both she gained at the London Aeroplane Club under the tutelage of Captain Valentine Baker, because he learnt to fly in World War One, when, because if you joined the Royal Navy Air Service, because that was later to become the RAF, I think in 1917 or 18. And she was also the first British woman to gain an engineer's license as well. So not only did she fly the planes, but she's able to maintain the planes as well. And I think she part built some of the planes to improve their performance as well. Unusually in this is that her father was very supportive of her and actually gave her money to buy planes and to maintain them as well. And maybe it sort of paid off when he probably gained the most famous daughter who sort of changed aviation history in the world. So she also became a friend, looking back in Yorkshire, of Fred Slingsby. And because he also trained to become a pilot during World War One, and then started to develop and build gliders, first at Scarborough and then at Kirby Moorside. Because Slingsby Aviation then produced trainer planes for use in war and for other people to gain licenses as well. I don't know if it exists or not still, but it certainly was in the 1990s. Slingsby Aviation was around there. But Fred Slingsby also founded the Yorkshire Gliding Club. That's the one on top of Sutton Bank that still exists today. And Amy was a member there as well. But she gained worldwide recognition in 1930 when she became the first woman to fly solo from England to Australia, leaving Croydon Airport in Surrey on the 5th of May that year and landing at Darwin on the 24th of May. And she covered 11,000 miles in that. And literally, I think she sort of got a map and drew a straight line across it. And she really had to maintain to that line, whatever terrain it went across, largely because that's where she could land in some of these places to refuel her plane. Because if you deviated from that, she'd been completely lost as well. And then in July 1931, she and co-pilot Jack Humphreys became the first people to fly from London to Moscow in a day. That was 1,760 miles, a journey lasting 21 hours. And Gazeba even continued from there, went across Siberia and then on to Tokyo, setting a sort of a world record of flight time from Britain to Japan. I think the problem with these, what we probably don't appreciate today, is that these, as you can see in the plane behind, really open air structures, because they with nothing to keep you warm, and it being incredibly cold at the high altitudes, very windy as well, fairly primitive, because these days before radar and things like that, of really knowing where she was going, so that they were sort of having to use maps and other types of things like that. So I think that's the greatest achievement to me of all the things, is sort of these long hours that she had to do. Quite often they'd have to fly for 8 hours at a time, because that one to Moscow was 21 hours, and because the fatigue and the coldness of that would have been incredible. In 1932, she married Scottish pilot Jim Mollinson, who had proposed to her during a flight, but they'd only met 8 hours earlier, but because that marriage wasn't to last. In July 1932, she set a solo record flight from London to Cape Town, breaking her new husband's record as well. Perhaps that led to the breakdown in their marriage. He didn't want her to have one over her as well. And they divorced in 1938, shortly after that. And I could say all these pictures of sort of look at that plane behind, looks like it sort of caught fire or demolished or something like that. But she's a very glamorous one. So you can imagine her being attractive to, especially to women, that they can actually go out and do these things herself. But unfortunately, on the 5th of January 1941, she'd helped the RAF move planes around the country. I think it was quite a common occupation for quite a few people, because the planes were never perhaps in the right places. I know that in Knaresborough Parish Church, there's a plaque in there to someone who died crashing into the Nid Gorge because they got lost en route as well. And they were moving planes around as well. She was going from Prestwick to RAF Kidlington, which is now London Oxford Airport. And it was on a very wet, snowy day. And it said that she got lost, came out of fuel, and bailed out as her aircraft crashed into the River Thames near Herne Bay around about 3:30 in the afternoon. A convoy of vessels in the Thames spotted her parachute opening and because she was alive when she was spotted in the water, calling for help. But conditions were poor, with a heavy sea and a strong tide, and it's thought that she's actually got dragged under the boat that went out to rescue her. So it's rather unfortunate, really, for that as well. And they thought that probably how she drowned. I don't think they ever found her body after that, and she was just aged 37 when she died. There's blue plaques for her, as I mentioned, on where she lived in Hull, on 2 of those properties there. And her father gave a collection of souvenirs to Sowerby Hall at Bridlington in 1958. And there's a room in Sowerby Hall to that collection as well, called the Amy Johnson Room as well. And there are also a couple of statues of her in Hull. Let's see if I got one on the next slide. Here we go. Is that there's one on Prospect Street in Hull, unveiled in 1974, is where the school that was named after her was built, but that was knocked down in 2016, and a new statue has been placed in that area in the middle of a park, and that was unveiled by Maureen Lipman in 2016, and herself born in Hull as well. She's currently in Coronation Street, and that's off Hawthorne Avenue, if people know Hull at all, on Bramshaw Street, because that's the site of a former Amy Johnson school, and now on a middle of a housing estate just called Amy Johnson. It's not too far from her second home as well. So that's Amy Johnson. I forgot there's also this awful statue of her as well in down the side of a shopping centre in Hull as well. I think probably the less talked about that, the better. But the other one is a bronze, and it's actually quite a nice statue. Makes her look quite fat in the face, this one does, and the uniform she got on make it look very bulky as well. But obviously that's the style that she wanted to portray, this glamorous aviator as well, with the flying goggles on. And now on to a contemporary of Henry Moore's, Barbara Hepworth, born into very similar circumstances as Henry Moore, not too far away. She was born right in the centre of Wakefield, excuse me, on the 10th of January 1903, on the 15 Duke of York Street, just off the city centre. If you sort of know Wakefield, if you come in, let's say, from the Leeds side, which I guess most people would do, coming down the M1 and taking the one off to the city centre, you come in past the girls' grammar school and the A61, is it? Let me see where I am. Yeah, the A61 it turns into a dual carriageway, just as it sort of touches the edge of the city centre, turns left, and therefore you have the, I think there's a giant Tesco, but at least certainly the back of the Trinity Walk shopping centre. That's a fairly new one that was built. And just to the left across there are streets of houses, and that's where the Duke of York Street is. And there is a plaque on her house, similar to the other houses I've shown, because they were Henry Moore was born, a fairly typical red brick terrace, a street of terrace houses all the way down there. Nothing special about it at all. She was the eldest child of Herbert and Gertrude Hepworth. And so her father was a civil engineer for the West Riding County Council and became county engineer in 1921. So weren't a very poor family. She herself attended Wakefield Girls High School, because it's about a 5 minutes walk away onto the Leeds Road, and started there in 1909. She awarded a music prize, unusually, in 1912, and then won a scholarship to go to the Leeds School of Art in 1920. So that's the year that Henry Moore was starting at the School of Art as well. And they actually did become friends, and because they established, I guess, a bit of rivalry between them, because it's really Barbara Hepworth that first did these sort of pierced type sculptures, but Henry Moore also used, like I on his reclining figures and all sorts of other things. So perhaps they sort of influenced one another, but it was Barbara Hepworth that produced those to begin with. In 1922, she was awarded a diploma from the Royal College of Art, and in 1923, but stays on a further year to compete in the Prix de Rome, but doesn't win the coveted prize, but a chap called John Skeeping does. But she does gain again a travel scholarship from the West Riding and goes to Siena and Rome with Skeeping and marries him on the 13th of May 1925 in Florence. I can say it was really whilst in Italy that she learns how to carve marble by an Italian sculptor called Giovanni Ardini. They remain out there 2 years and then return to London in 1929. But unfortunately for Mr. Skeeping is that she meets the abstract painter Ben Nicholson in 1931. Both were married at the time, and then Skeeping and her got divorced the following year at her instigation. In that year, it was sort of 1931 that she first sort of started to sculpture with these holes in them, if I can use that terminology, because so those are her pierced figures that she really has characterized the rest of her life's work with, and obviously influenced Henry Moore. I forgot to mention is that Ben Nicholson, he was an abstract artist as well, and as famous in his own right as Barbara Hepworth is, but maybe as a famous sculptress is that she's got the edge on him. And because they had children in 1934. I do put that in plural because she had triplets in that year. But she always made time to sculpt. She said a woman artist should not be deprived, a woman artist is not deprived by cooking and having children, nor by nursing children with measles, even in triplicate. One is in fact nourished by this rich life, provided one always does some work each day, even a single half hour, so that the images grow in one's mind. Say she eventually marries Ben Nicholson on the 17th of November 1938 after he gets a divorce, and they marry at the Hampstead Registered Office in London. And at the outbreak of World War II, they go to live at St Ives in Cornwall, because it was a relatively well-known artist colony at that time. I did the sort of story behind it because it actually grew out of Staves in North Yorkshire, where two of the artists left from there, who established it, left there to go and establish the St Ives School of Art. So that'd be why she'd be attracted down there. Her studio was called Trewin, and she sort of had that studio from 1949 until her death in 1975. Her marriage to Nicholson didn't survive. They divorced in 1951. And then, you see, she used then different materials. She started one time only working in stone of wood, and now started to work in bronze and clay. And she said of her life in Yorkshire, I think I have a photograph here, yep. The whole of this Yorkshire background means more to me as the years have passed. I draw on these early experiences, not only visually in texture and contour, but humanely. The importance of man in landscape was stressed by the seeming contradiction of the industrial town springing out of the inner beauty of the country. So that's where we see it, is that, but she dies of an accidental fire at her studios in St Ives on 20th of May, 1975, at the age of 72. She's been more honoured, more recently, dying, in 1975. The Hepworth Art Gallery, in her honour, opened in Wakefield in 2011. That's down by the River Calder that flows through the city, fairly close to the Chantry Chapel on the bridge, which is just across the road there. So there's not only her work in there, but they're touring exhibitions. It's free to go in, quite difficult to get to unless you know Wakefield fairly well. And the car park is fairly awkward to find as well. Her work is also on display, so you see over here, at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and some of that has been in there since that first opened as well. So I guess those are two giants of the sort of art world, represented really in that, as they call it now, the Yorkshire Sculpture Triangle between the Henry Moore Gallery, the Hepworth and the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. All can be visited roughly in one day, I guess, if you run around. And now on to the last chap, Sir David Brown. He was really a story of an engineering family dynasty, I guess. His grandfather was David Brown, who established a pattern manufacturing company in Huddersfield in 1860. And then in 1873 goes on to concentrate on producing gear systems, and in 1898 into specialized machine cut gears as well, if you're interested in that type of thing. But those gearing essential for the textile industry and other industries, those sort of cogs and gears to make the machinery go faster, smoother, and more cheaply, more efficiently run as well. Because in 1902 they opened the giant part works in Huddersfield that covered 17 acres, and unfortunately for David Brown, the grandfather, he dies in 1903 in that following year. Really, it's near enough the year just before really that David Brown himself, that we're going to look at, was born. He was born in Park Cottage, 1904. And the cottage stood in the grounds of that great manufacturing company he had in Huddersfield as well, because his father, Frank Brown, obviously working within the family industry as well. And he was born in Park Cottage, but that no longer stands today. It was pulled down in World War II as the company made even bigger to cope with the demand for their machinery during the war. He was educated at King James's Grammar School at Almonbury. That's just outside Huddersfield, but if you think of Castle Hill, that is Almonbury, around there. And then he went to the private Rossall School near Fleetwood, just north of Blackpool. Going back to the family company, is that when David Brown, the grandfather, died, his sons Percy and Frank took over, and you could say it was Frank that was the David Brown's father in the story. And because they continue to manufacture gears as well, and they start taking to manufacture castings as well for motor vehicles, for aircraft, ships, and other industrial applications. And they go on to make and design a valveless car as well in 1908 under the engineer Frederick Burgess. He was later another engineer who looked at the car, the Humber, and because they also looked at developing the Bentley engine as well. So these were quite influential people at the time, but probably not on Sir David Brown, but it was coming through the company, this work in the car business as well. And then in 1913, the company established a joint venture in America to form worm drive units. And you probably laugh at that, but anybody knows in engineering, not myself really, it's a screw and cog unit where the cog is at the bottom and the screw turns on the top, turning the cog round underneath. It's fairly typical in probably children's educational toys today. And it saw really the with the outbreak of World War I, the business in Huddersfield, so a lot of these companies expanded and went into new applications really for military purposes. And they see their employment grow on Huddersfield from 200 people to 1,000 people. And they're starting now to build propulsion units for warships and drive mechanisms for armaments. And I say all these textile companies, engineering companies, because they're all driven production for the war. And in 1921, it's the largest producer of worm gear in the world. That's an awful word, isn't it? Worm gear. Like I say, it was in that year he left school age 17, did Sir David Brown, and he started at the bottom. And I guess his father was saying, you're not going to be, although you might have had a good education, you're learning this business from the top upwards as well. And so he came on as an apprentice right at the bottom of the company, and learnt through that way. But it probably his mother was a bit more influential in his love for engineering and cars. His father, although they produce stuff for cars and things like that, actually couldn't drive. And it was his mother that was a keen driver and sort of gave him, as we'll see a bit later on, that love of motor vehicles as well. Because although his father might not have driven, he actually bought him a motorbike so he could get to work earlier and quicker. But that motorbike he bought was a 1000cc Reading Standard. And the 1000cc motorbike, even today, is probably near enough one of the most powerful machines you can get. It's basically you're riding an engine, but probably capable of going from 0 to sort of 80 in probably a couple of seconds. But he improved the importance, the performance of his motorbike even further by modifying the engine, because he took part in these sort of hill trial competitions that were very well known in the 1920s. I've shown you a bit of film, if you've been around, when I've looked at the Kettlewell speed climbs that went up Park Rash in the 1920s. A bloke going up there on a 1913 motorbike. So these hills at Kettlewell were unmade tracks at the road. They weren't tarmac like they are today. It's got like a double S bend in it as well. But it was quite a thing in the 20s and 30s, is that a lot of these earlier motorbikes didn't have gears, and that's probably where David Brown himself was coming on here, modifying his motorbikes to make sure that it was easier to get up these hills, because quite often is that you had to balance power and speed and things like that to get up these hills. But I say, with the advent of sort of where his father's work was involved in these new gears and things like that, that's what he'd been adapting to that. He was invited onto the Isle of Man TT races. His fame was so well known, but his father forbade him. You probably read about the number of accidents and deaths that occur annually on that track. But his father also disapproved of his relationship with a local girl, Daisy Firth, who was 3 years older than himself. So that was probably seen as a bad thing. And they tried to break them up. And he was sent out to South Africa in 1922, to sell, I guess, these gears to use in the gold mining industry around there. And eventually sort of takes over the running of that element of the company back down there. And then returns back from South Africa and back to Huddersfield, and he starts to design his own car. He was meant to be doing this outside of work, but obviously he needed to use some of the machinery inside of work to complete some of these things. His father found out what was going on and banished him from the works, from doing any of those things for the car improvement. That didn't stop him and continued to build a car. It was called the Daybro. And this car that he built was capable of doing 140 miles an hour. We're talking about the late 1920s here as well. It was so fast that he was introduced to the team of Aston Martin as well, who were producing these racing cars for the tracks that were very popular at the time, and I guess still are today. And unfortunately for his father is that David Brown marries Daisy, and his parents actually refused to attend the wedding. And I guess he hoped that David here would maybe make a marriage of convenience with another industrialist in the north to enlarge the industrialist work up here as well. He'd known her since they were 14 as well. They had 2 children, David and Angela, because David entered into succeeding his father into the business. Because he'd sort of studied around the world as well, and going to various factories in the US, Africa, and in Europe. And he looks at the sort of the expansion of the Huddersfield works as well. They take over the Penistone Steelworks in 1934, a former bronze and steel foundry. You can say that was about to close because that was, I think, the 32, 33, 34 were really bad years of the trade depression in Britain as well. They were quite lucky. Obviously, they bought it probably for next to nothing, but it moved them into another sphere of engineering. We looked at aircraft frames, electricity power stations, and other things like that they could cast on that site, which they didn't have the capability of before there as well, because it went off into oil fields and later off into oil refineries as well. Eventually that foundry business sold to William Cook of Sheffield in 1988, but closed in 2002, has been demolished in Penistone, and housing is now on that site. David Brown, what we're looking at here, it's only a photograph I could really find of him, was made director of the company in 1929 and managing director in 1931. And it was really when he became managing director is that the whole Browns became a completely different company. He really went off in two different directions. In 1936, they started production of tractors for Ferguson on the Huddersfield site, but there's disagreement between the two companies, which led to Brown producing their own tractors. And in 1939, they bought a giant site out at Meltham. I guess it's just southwest of Huddersfield. And really the whole of Meltham became involved around the Browns tractor works down there as well. And so they had that as a major tractor operation, probably one of the largest in Britain. They're quite iconic amongst farmers, and I think there's a Brown Society where they go and display these tractors and probably have tractor runs and things like that. They are so well liked, but they sold the tractor division to the US company Case in 1972. But the other way he went off was in the direction of probably his greatest interest, speed. Car manufacturer Bentley, whose motto was to build a good car, a fast car, the best in class, went into liquidation in 1931. And I said these early years of the 1930s were a terrible trade depression. And that's why we see him here playing the sort of, I guess, the playboy type image in him. The liquidator of Bentley was looking for £250,000, but Brown didn't make an offer on the company because he thought that if he put in an offer, it would be the lowest. But because of the economic depression, I guess it's probably like today, if no one wanted taking on sort of concrete shops, is that people, these businesses dropped out because they couldn't think they could make a go of Bentley. And so the buildings were sold on to another company, and Brown took over for £52,000 the rest of the company, that's the manufacturing plant and the rights to the new engine designed by the founder, W.O. Bentley, Walter Owen Bentley. And so now he found himself in the motor car business, although production didn't really start until after World War II. But it's really in the war that he probably his love for cars and putting the money into that side of thing on the Aston Martin front that we're looking here, that he made a lot of the money from that Meltham factory in there, that he could put it into the car business. 1951, they had the original site in Huddersfield. They still had the steel worked out at Penistone, and this giant factory, but site here we can see out at Meltham. He had 150 acres of land, and they also rented additional floor space as well. They also went into business with electric motors with Brook Crompton out at Brockholes, which is on the Sheffield Road from Huddersfield. So all within sort of a 10-mile radius, I guess, of the town centre. Those electrical components, again, went on to be sort of electrical harnesses and all those other types of things when you open up your engine and have a look in there, have a fiddle around, then close it again because you don't know what anything is in them. But so I guess a lot of electrical components going into cars. He divorced Daisy and remarried his secretary, Marjorie, in 1955. I guess so that didn't last very long either. And he then married his personal assistant, Paula Stone, in 1980. He was knighted for his services to industry in 1968, I could say, rather as the David Brown tractors and the Aston Martin range that he was producing, really at the height of the fame of both tractors and those sort of very high performance sports cars as well. But in February 1972, the David Brown Corporation was in financial difficulties, and they were forced to sell the tractor division, as I mentioned before, to Case in America, and Aston Martin Lagonda to another buyer as well. The 1988 is that really the factory out at Meltham came to an end and closed officially in January 1990. He'd already sold his shares in the David Brown Corporation, so it's quite clever, this, moving money around and being director of one and things like that. So he sold his shares in the David Brown Corporation for £46 million. He died on the September 1993 at Monte Carlo at the age of 89. There's no statues around him from anything, but I guess it's these people that have formed the David Brown Tractor Club, and they have a museum at Spinksmire Mill at Meltham that's only open on Sundays from 10 to 3 o'clock. But like I say, a man, like I say, of a certain time that really sort of developed, like I say, these engines and industrial processes that really put sort of, I guess, Huddersfield and engineering on the map. Probably more likely, more the iconic Aston Martins produced when he was the owner of that business. So that brings us to the end of today.